The Citizen Mike Show. News. Commentary. Interviews. Citizen Mike Show starts now.
Welcome to the Citizen Mike Show. Thanks for tuning in. We do appreciate it. My name is Mike Brudzinski. On my right is the editor of the Record Journal, Ralph Tomaselli, and two special guests in the studio today. He is Gary Roberge from the state of Connecticut Judicial Branch, and Tasha Hunt, also from the state of Connecticut Judicial Branch. So I'm going to ask them to give their titles and a quick one-sentence description of your responsibilities with the state of Connecticut. Gary, take it away.
Sure. Thank you, Mike. I'm the executive director of the Judicial Branch's Court Support Services Division, and I'm responsible to manage all of the adult probation, juvenile probation, pretrial services, family, criminal, and civil, and juvenile residential services. That's what we do when we work for the judges of the Superior Court.
So this episode is about juvenile justice and juvenile court. So Tasha Hunt, how do you fit into that picture of juvenile justice?
Yes, so my role is Deputy Director of Juvenile Probation. I also work for the Judicial Branch Court Support Services Division. And in my role, I'm responsible for the management and oversight of our 11 juvenile probation offices in the state. I work directly with the regional managers, the supervisors, and the staff in those offices.
Yeah, so if we're going to talk about juvenile justice, we can't do better than this. Right. Yes. You know, you can't get any better than this. Just to start, because we got a lot of things we want to cover, but just to start, Gary, if you would go first and then Tasha pick it up when Gary leaves off, a quick description of the juvenile court system, the juvenile justice system, its goals, its means and methods, how you're doing, and maybe distinguish it from the adult court, the regular superior court.
Yeah, sure. So I'll start and give a general overview of the courts. We have 11 juvenile court locations throughout the state. We get in roughly between 8,500 and 9,000 referrals of juveniles a year to the court system. The juvenile court goes up to the age of 17. Okay, there are some charges in which a juvenile will go directly to the adult court. There's very few of those, and that's only juveniles that are 15 or older, right? We have about 120 juvenile probation officers that work for us in the branch, and we have supervisors and managers on top of that, and we manage approximately 2,000 cases on any given day.
Tasha?
Sure. As it relates to juvenile probation and our role, it really is to support the court. As Gary shared with you, we have, kids who are referred to the court. We work directly with the clients who are referred as well as with their families. And so you asked a question about just the goals of the juvenile justice system. And as it relates to juvenile probation, our role is to really work within a risk reduction framework. We are committed to making sure that kids are, when they come into the court, that their needs are met and that we are able to connect them to the appropriate services and really respond to the behaviors bringing them into court just within a risk reduction framework. And so we're looking to make sure that they don't reoffend. Some of our goals really rest upon, certainly accountability, public safety. We want to ensure that we are responding to, certainly the offense. And we want to make sure that when we are working with clients that we are using our best tools to assess them and connect them to the right services so that we can then make sure they don't return to the system.
I like that start.
Yeah.
So what we've done for the both of you is we've put together a bunch of propositions, a bunch of statements, positions that either we've heard or we've imagined people are thinking or talking about, or we've read in the press. And we've strung these together. We're going to deal them out. Ralph and I are going to deal them out to you one at a time. My hope is that, as at least on my part, when I deal it out, I inject a little false attitude. You know, I want a little edge to it. And whether or not I believe the attitude I inject is a totally different matter. But there are a lot of folks out there watching the juvenile court system, and some have faith and some don't have faith. And so we want to, in part, be their voice at least for the first part of the question, and then we'll get your response to it. So again, these are, I don't know, we have 10 or 15 little
Right,
questions we
right.
want to throw out. You drew the name out of the hat
Right.
to go first,
I'll go first.
so hit it.
And this is one of the most common ones that we hear, which is that teenagers know that there are no real consequences to juvenile crimes.
What do you think, Gary?
Well, I think there certainly are consequences to juvenile crimes. I guess that's in the perception of the individual. But I can tell you that when juveniles come into the system, as Tasha talked about, and they're referred to us by the judges, right? That's what happens, and we work with our kids. We work for the judges. We go through a process, and it's about risk reduction, and it's about changing behavior from committing crimes to not committing crimes, right? But there's certainly consequences. Being under juvenile probation supervision is a consequence. Being in detention possibly while your case is pending is a consequence. Being adjudicated and having to remain in a secured setting is a consequence. So there are certainly consequences in the system from my perspective.
Yeah. Tasha?
I agree. I think, certainly there is that perception. And one of the things that juvenile probation officers are, obligated to do is to ensure that when a child comes into the court and they are placed under the order of the court, that they are monitoring those court orders and responding to any noncompliance. Juvenile probation officers have a graduated response system in place that really allows them to respond to noncompliance just based on the nature of that compliance. They have several options available to them to respond, and they also have incentives, which goes hand in hand. And so there are ways that officers can use that graduated response system to discourage the negative behaviors and encourage the positive behavior.
So I want to get a little bit more specific. Can you give us some examples of what a judge's order might be, or the range of orders that a judge might give that your crew would have to sort of monitor and enforce, I guess?
Correct. It definitely does depend on the status of the case. The number one thing that a judge must do is really find probable cause. And once a judge has found probable cause that the child has committed, a delinquent act or has violated a court, order, that judge is then able to make a determination around what should happen with the case. In the juvenile court system, cases come in to the court and they are dealt with in one of two ways, either non-judicially or judicially. A non-judicial case handling is more of an informal process with the probation officer in which the officer is working directly with the client and family to address the behaviors bringing them into court. Non-judicial handling, that informal processing is really designated for those first and second time offenses.
So let me throw some stuff out and just kind of crazy. Would drug testing be part of it? Would check-in once a week be part of it? Would find a job be part of it? And I'm throwing stuff out that I have no idea if this is realistic or not, if sort of relying on you guys. Would do your homework every day? I mean, I'm not sure what the judges might do that.
You absolutely are right. And some of the things that you mentioned, when I was sharing with you about non-judicial cases, probation officers have the authority in those types of informal cases to put certain things like that in place. But for the judicial case that's gone in front of the judge can order drug testing, can order the client to cooperate with psychological examinations. The judge can order that the child not, commit any new offenses. They must attend school. They must adhere to, the rules in the home. The probation officer is typically granted authority to use graduated responses, which means that probation officer can do everything from, warn the child regarding noncompliance all the way up to electronic monitoring if there's a need to do that.
Okay. So that's what I'm going to ask you. So judge puts an order on, you try to enforce it, and the kid says, make me. Nah, 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 make me. Not doing it. Thumb their nose at the system. What happens?
No, go ahead, Tosh.
I was just going to say we learned, over the years, we've learned a lot, about, really just the adolescent brain. And we learned a lot about what it takes to, beyond just working with juveniles, what it takes to really change behaviors and to get, a client to the place where they're able to see for themselves through the use of training that probation officers receive in motivational interviewing, as well as strength-based approaches, to really help that client begin to identify the areas of concern and to articulate, how they can be a part of the change process. And so it really is all around cognitive, development and really tapping into the client's strengths and getting them to a place where they are a part of the solution, because we all know that, just telling anyone to make a change just based on our own personal experiences, that's not, an easy thing to do.
Yeah, Ralph.
And I think what you're getting at, and I wanted to ask this, and it gets to where the original premise comes from. It sounds to me like the goal here is to make sure that the juvenile offenders don't become adult offenders. Whereas I think when people say there are no real consequences, they want 16-year-olds or 15-year-olds treated like adults. So, and I think there's some studies that show that if you don't try to, at some point at 15, 16, or 17, try some of these approaches, the percentage of people that will end up in the adult system. Do I have that? Is that where this is coming from?
Yeah, I think we absolutely agree with that. And the reality is, right, Ralph, that 15, 16, and 17-year-olds are not adults, right? I mean,
Right.
As Tasha said, their brains are still developing, and they have much different needs and much different thought processes than adults do. So it's our job to work with them, as Tasha said, to motivate them, to identify how they can move forward in a positive manner, and to try to keep them out of the system, right? I think, Mike had asked initially about any similarities in the adult system or differences. The similarities is that, we have adults that will not comply with the orders of a court on the adult side, right? So it's the same on the juvenile side. And at the end of the day, if that continues to happen, we'll bring them back to court, and they ultimately have to answer to the judge, right? But really, it's through the work of our juvenile probation officers and our adult probation officers on the adult side that we're looking for that behavior change, so that they're not committing new offenses and our communities are safer, and, the state's in a better place.
I'm going to take the next one.
Good.
So, as in your answer to what I'm about to ask you, if you could incorporate an explanation of the raise the age law, because I'm going to address that in this comment. So the raise the age law was an absolute disaster. And now there's a movement or recommendations from experts to raise the age even more. Yeah? What's going on here?
Yeah, so...
Notice the attitude. I tried
Yeah.
to notice that. I tried to, okay, good.
Yes,
I didn't want that to be wasted,
we did,
you know?
right? So we implement laws that the General Assembly passes, right? That's what we do in the branch. So when the raise the age came through, and in 2010, I think the 16-year-olds came in, and then in 2012, the 17-year-olds.
Go slowly at this point so we all understand
I'm sorry.
what that means.
Okay,
Yeah,
so
yeah.
the 16 and 17-year-olds were historically processed, adjudicated in the adult system. And then the legislature decided that we would raise the age of the juvenile court jurisdiction to include 16 and 17-year-olds. We were one of the last 3 states, I think, in the country in which 16 and 17-year-olds were adjudicated in the adult system. So in 2010, 16-year-olds were added to the juvenile system. In 2012, 17-year-olds were added to the juvenile system. And I can tell you from the data that we did not see the cases coming into the juvenile court that we thought we would see with respect to 16 and 17-year-olds. So 16 and 17-year-olds are being arrested at lower rates now than they were in the past. There are fewer young people in adult prisons today in the 18 to 21-year-old range than there have been in the past. So the thought that raise the age 16 and 17 9 and 7 years ago is a disaster, I think the data would maybe suggest otherwise.
So someone wants to raise it more. What's the current thinking there?
So again, that's a decision that has to be made by, our legislators, the General Assembly, and if they determine that that's the course that they feel is appropriate for the state to move forward in, we will implement those changes in the court system.
Let me read something.
You're good.
This comes from the TOW, T-O-W, I think.
TOW.
TOW?
Yeah.
Youth Justice Institute, the very part of the University of New Haven. And they have hundreds of pages of stuff on juvenile justice. Very good. It's very good. But I picked this one out. Studies show that young people prosecuted as adults are more likely to reoffend and even to escalate into more serious crimes than their peers prosecuted in juvenile court, creating a threat to the safety of communities. In addition, youth in adult prison are also at high risk for suicide and assault. A misconception about the raise the age legislation is the impact on community safety. The change does not mean that youth 15 to 20 years old charged with serious crimes would would be processed in the juvenile system. They will continue to be transferred into the adult system. And this has to do with what we now, it goes on to say, what is known about brain development from studies of neuroscience tells us the adult justice system does not work effectively for the emerging adult population ages 18 to 21. I think that is sort of where you were going with this, but there's something else out of there that I wanted to run by you. There seems to be a recommendation that the removal of youth whose cases are transferred to the adult court from custody by July 1, 2021. I'm not sure what that means, but does that mean every juvenile in the adult correctional system will be pulled out?
Sure.
That's the
So,
recommendation. That's not the law, but I understand
Right.
that's the recommendation.
so that's a recommendation that's coming out of
Are you
the-
getting paid enough to monitor all this stuff and implement it here? or-
Yeah, we could get to that too.
Okay. That's-
So the recommendation is coming out of the Juvenile Justice Policy Oversight Commission, the JJPOC, and that recommendation is is suggesting that 18, 19, and 20-year-olds are not housed in Department of Correction adult facilities while their cases are pending or after they're adjudicated if there's a period of incarceration. It does not say that they would be housed by the judicial branch. It says 18, 19, and 20-year-olds will not be housed in a Department of Correction facility.
Where are they supposed to go?
That's the question. So I
Yeah.
think the TOW Youth Institute is going to be working with some national experts to see how other states handle that age range in the criminal justice system in different states, and to make a recommendation to the JJPOC and ultimately to the legislature through the JJPOC as to what an appropriate course of action may be for where those kids are held.
Yeah, Ralph.
Well, I think you're making some excellent points, and what I was also trying to get across was that statistically, putting people in jail at younger ages presents long-term problems. The issue that I see as a journalist is, and I've seen it over time, and especially of late with car break-ins, is if you've had your car broken into, or if you're in a neighborhood where 20 people have had a car broken into, this just sounds like, not them, me and you, kind of liberal leftist theory that really isn't solving crime. And I don't know how to address that. I don't think there's any way to address that with people, but that's how it sounds.
Well, let me take a swing at it,
Yeah,
then
good.
we'll go to Gary and Tasha. So if the data shows if a juvenile goes into doing hard time or
Right,
whatever you
right.
want to call it, they go into hard time. They also get out.
Right.
They also get out. So
good
everyone
point.
feels great we put them away,
Yeah,
we
right.
threw away
Good
the key, we were tough on them, we showed them real consequence, but then they get out. And the worse than when they go in.
Right.
And so maybe short term you feel good
Right.
about, we were tough on them. But long term, it comes back to haunt you. That decision to be tough comes back to haunt you because they come out worse than before committing more crimes. I mean, is that the thinking, the theory? Is that the data? Is that what are your thoughts on my
Yeah,
thoughts here?
absolutely. I mean, everything that we've read, as it relates to just the research done in this category is spot on as it relates to just the long term, negative effects of placing kids in, prison doing hard time. I think, aside from what you spoke of with respect to suicides and assaults, I think we can't overlook the fact that the juvenile justice system really provides a developmentally appropriate response to the needs of juveniles. And so they're able to get that rehabilitation that's needed, through services that are designed, to really address the root cause of what's bringing them into the system. A lot of our children that we see, oftentimes they're coming with significant mental health, concerns, disorders. They're coming to us with, extensive, abuse and neglect histories. They need the type of support, to address those, unfortunate circumstances as opposed to just locking them up.
So maybe the hardest question I have for the both of you on this topic is, I know that's the theory, to give them support, give them help, give them treatment, give them guidance, at the same time holding them accountable. And I'm talking about the population that are confined in some way at various levels. Are they really getting the kind of help, support that they need? I know in theory that's supposed to be how it goes, but is it happening?
Yeah, I mean, I think here in Connecticut, we're fortunate that we do have a good amount of resources that are available to the youth that we serve, and whether it's through how our juvenile probation officers, approach their supervision of these kids in conjunction with the community-based services that we have that are available to them for the cognitive behavioral thinking treatment, right, that Tasha was talking about before. We have residential programs that get to behavioral health issues, to substance abuse issues. So we do have a fairly
working, you think?
robust. We are definitely changing behavior of kids, but they're kids, and it has to be the right time. It's the same on the adult side, right? That the timing has to be right, the engagement has to be right. But we are seeing positive outcomes with the kids that we work with in the juvenile probation system. Sure.
So don't be surprised if a year from now, 2 years from now, we see another initiative in the legislature to raise the age again from 18 to 19-year-olds. That seems to be where the studies are going, but just based on my reading. So I got another one for you. Change the subject.
Absolutely.
So neighborhood in Wallingford is raided, right? Car break-ins. I'm not saying thefts necessarily, but let's throw in a theft or two. A quick joyride around the block or something, and they leave the car at some parking lot in the middle of town. And the police catch them red-handed. They got to let them go. So we hear they got to let them go. And it's called catch and release. And it doesn't work. It'll never work, but that's a system, and it ain't going to change. True,
Sure.
false, a mixture of the two?
So
what's going on there?
and
notice the attitude I try to get.
I can sense the attitude. Can you,
Good
Tasha?
job, Patty, yes.
I can sense, and I can sense the frustration on that too, because we've had conversations with different police chiefs from around the state about this issue, and there's grounds for detention. There's grounds to hold a juvenile in detention while the case is pending that a judge can act upon, and that is if they are a threat to the public or the community, if they're a threat not to show up for court, or if another state has an interest or a warrant in that juvenile, then they can be held. So there is a mechanism to hold that juvenile, and maybe you want to talk a little bit, Tasha, about when the police take a youth, a juvenile into custody, what their option is at that point to get the juvenile into detention?
Yeah, so, I think what happens at that first point of contact really determines kind of how that case moves along the system. The police officer has options available to them at the point of contact with, any child that's,
Point of contact is the arrest.
correct. So they come
Yeah,
into contact with that child and they determine there is, just cause for an arrest. That officer has the ability to just, issue a warning and release that child with no further action. They can issue a summons to that child and release them to a parent or a guardian, and in some instances, even to the child's, own custody, if that's appropriate. Police officers in most communities, not every community, has access to juvenile review boards and youth service bureaus where they can refer the child, or they can go to a judge and request an order to detain. And if that judge were to sign it and issue that order, that child can then be taken into custody. It does go back to what Gary talked about with respect to the grounds for detention, because a judge is going to have to find, when that officer comes to them with a request for an order to take that child into custody, they're going to ask, that officer very specifically to demonstrate that there's probable cause, that the child committed that offense, that there is no less restrictive environment where that child can go. And
What is that last one? What is less restrictive environment mean?
meaning that the only place that's appropriate based on the nature of that offense is detention.
They can't go
There
home, you
isn't,
mean? Is that what
it's
that
not
would mean?
appropriate to go anywhere like home or any other place that's less restrictive. And so once that judge makes that finding, they also have to find that the child has, or meets the grounds for detention. And Gary outlined what those grounds are. Once the judge signs that take into custody order, the police officer is then able to bring that child to any one of the two juvenile detention centers. The judge, will sign it, the child will go in, and then that child has to be presented to the court no less than 1 business day following, their detainment. Once that case goes into court, the judge is then going to, of course, speak to the issue of probable cause, and then there will be a determination made around if that child is in fact a risk to public safety. We have a process, an internal process that's driven by statute that requires the court to use a detention eligibility screen, which really looks at risk and determines if the child in fact is a risk to public safety. And that information is just presented to the judge as a guideline. And the judge has the discretion at that point to release or to remand that child to detention up to 7 days.
Your thoughts?
My thought is,
Or-
is that
yeah.
that there are actually a lot of options if you're a juvenile. Now, let's say the person that stole your car was 20 or 21. They're going to get a relatively low bail that they're going to be able to post, and they're going to be out right away. So I don't know where this comes from, that people must be not aware of the fact that adults have a right to bail. Bail cannot be used punitively, so relatively low bails are set. And again, I'll just make one other point. It's just a comment that people are so concerned about this catch and release when it comes to car break-ins and stolen cars by juveniles. But but what I see every day in working in a newsroom is domestic violent offenders who are adults who repeatedly offend and then are given a promise to appear back in court, no bail, usually with some restrictions, such as don't go near the person you just assaulted. And to me as a journalist, that just screams out to me so much more
Catch and release on
than
steroids.
So why, again, I'm not saying, listen, if my car is stolen, I'm angry. And I'm angry at the person that did it. I get that part. Yeah. But the context of it is that you have these domestic cases that talk about catch and release that are headed for disaster.
I want to put some details Tasha and Gary, on what you just described. So imagine it's 2:30 in the morning. Kid is caught red-handed, breaking into cars and then going on a joyride. Wallingford police officer shows up. Tasha, as you described, he has some choices. But my question is, does he really? He has to call up a judge. I think I said 2:30 in the morning. Is a judge going to be answering the phone?
Yes, there
Okay.
is
That's-
certainly on-call availability throughout the state.
And so, can the judge give sort of an on-the-spot or an emailed or faxed signed order? So, yeah, lock them up. I mean, can the judge do that
The judge is going to want to see
upon a showing?
the documents
Yeah.
outlining where the probable cause is so that they can then move forward with signing the actual
But
order.
let's say the judge is satisfied, but I can see the police officer's got some paperwork now that, sort of a burden of proof he's got to make out to the judge. I'm getting that. And then if the judge signs some sort of a detention order, what does the Wallingford police officer do with his juvenile? He's got the juvenile in his left hand and an order from the judge in the right hand. Where's he got to go? Bridgeport, Hartford? He's got to put in for overtime if he's about to get off shift. I mean, he can't put him in the Wallingford lockup, I assume, because that's an adult cell,
Correct.
basically. And is there room in Bridgeport, in Hartford? Are there beds? Are there slots? Or is the police officer being told, don't take him here, we don't have room for him?
Right. There is no question that there's always, room and available resources. It doesn't, go without question that it requires, some work on the part of the officer to complete the paperwork and to provide, the necessary transportation. But, there's always an opportunity for us to receive a child that, has an active order.
Ralph, you're up.
Well, this is one that I sometimes try to explain to people who have just had their car broken into, and I get nowhere, and I just want to, this is what they're saying to me. Motor vehicle thefts are up all over the state, and they're spiking, and no one's doing anything about it. So they feel overwhelmed by car break-ins and thefts.
Yeah, so I think in the last year and a half, there has been a slight increase in car thefts throughout the state. There's some presentations out there that the Office of Policy and Management has presented on some data in which it shows that car thefts are significantly down from 15, 20 years ago. And that's true across the country. But what's also true across the country is that other states are also seeing a slight increase in car thefts, right? I would just say to people, take your key fobs out of the car so it's not in there, because many of these car thefts are the result of people leaving their fobs in cars. And I've had my car broken into, and I can understand how that feels and the frustration. But the fact of the matter is that, and a big spike. So with repeat offenders, we know that there's a small percentage of kids that are doing multiple offenses, right? So it's not like there's a large group of kids out there throughout the state committing multiple offenses. It's a small group of kids that we know are repeat offenders on this.
Yeah. Follow up?
Well, just some statistics that Gary touched on, but just to highlight it. And this is on motor vehicle theft. Connecticut motor vehicle thefts, as this report says, largely mirror the national trend. Over the last 10 years, motor vehicle thefts are down 19% nationally and 17% Connecticut. And for those of us like me, who's a journalist since the mid-'80s, this next one I know. Motor vehicle thefts are down 43% over the last 20 years in Connecticut. So, again, there has been some spike in recent years, but even when you count in those spikes, crime is down overall.
So there is a decrease in the big cities in
Right.
motor vehicle
Excellent point.
thefts, a big decrease.
Right.
But to some degree, the suburbs have seen a slight tick up. So the decrease in the big cities draws the larger number down.
Right.
But if you live in a, let's say, an affluent town bordering Route 91 or Route 84,
Right.
Susan, begin to tee up those maps. We're just a couple seconds away from that. And maybe in some of these suburbs, it's going up a bit. So maybe it depends on who you are, where you live,
Absolutely.
that guides your perception. So some people call it a spoken wheel trend, and this again comes from the Tau Youth Justice Institute, and I'm talking now about towns like Wallingford, under 50,000 population, according to this, all towns.
Right.
It's gone up. 27%. Less than 25,000 population, up 20%, 21%. You live in a small town, it goes up. But the
Absolutely.
numbers, absolute numbers are small because it's a small town, there's
Right.
few arrests, really just a handful of arrests. But it goes up by 5, and it may double the amount of arrests. In towns 25 to 50,000 population, the increase is 7%, and that would be Wallingford. Whereas the big cities, 50 to 100,000 population, down 16%, over 100,000 in population, down 29%, but the total is down 17%. Now, Waterbury's a special problem, and I don't want to get into the Waterbury situation because there's something going on there. They're going to have to figure that out on a regional, I guess, on a regional basis. Before we put up the maps, which is coming next, one of the researchers that appeared at one of these oversight committee meetings, I forgot the long name of the title, but it said that in his view, because the absolute numbers of increase in motor vehicle arrests are small, you can only solve 10% of the thefts. So you have a handful of cases. He seemed to be saying this is not the time on a handful of cases to make policy changes, and I don't want to get you guys into this, policy debate that's going on in
Thank
the
you.
legislature. But you're welcome, I guess. But just your thoughts on my thoughts, and then we'll get these hotspot maps up.
Yeah, I was at that presentation, and I think that it does clarify exactly what the issues are that we're facing here in this state. And I think that the point the presenter was trying to make is, do we want to really make significant policy changes in this state based on such a small number of cases? And I think it's to your point, Mike, right, that it is a small number of cases that we're talking about, even though it doesn't feel like that in our communities, right? It doesn't feel that way right now. But Ralph was just given the data here in Connecticut and nationally, and that's the data that we have to work with.
So we got some maps. I love maps.
Yeah, let's
Let's take
look
it
at
away.
maps.
Let's see what we got in the way of.
And it's good news if you live in Wallingford, isn't it, Mike?
I'd say.
Because the hotspots, and as I looked at it, and you'll keep me honest, the hotspots kind of start out here. This is 2010.
Yeah.
And the hotspot is to our southwest. Is that how I would describe that? If you can see Wallingford there, the hotspot is to our southwest.
In 2013.
Yeah, 2013.
It's sort of still there.
It's still there.
And Wallingford is really not
Nope, we're right on the border.
threatened by this data. Seems like Wallingford is, got some, but it's certainly not in the crosshairs of juvenile crime
Absolutely.
in 2013.
Okay.
So if Wallingford had a problem, comparatively speaking, it wasn't much of one, comparatively speaking.
Right.
Cold comfort if you live in a neighborhood that's been raided by a couple of kids.
No,
though.
well, I think we've said that. Now, this
Yeah.
one is 2015, and I found this interesting because the hotspot moves north of us.
Right.
And yet Wallingford, once again, remains out of the hotspot.
It escapes, doesn't it?
And are we
What's the
gonna look at
latest? We got one more. I think.
2017. Now it really is north of us.
Yeah.
But again, Wallingford stays out of the hot zone. So actually, if you live in Wallingford, these hot zones have been right up against us, but it's never moved into town.
So, Gary first and then Tasha, what's the takeaway? I mean, we have maps. What's the lesson, I guess, if any, from
Yeah,
this data?
so what we're concentrating on is there, and Tasha talked about this earlier, we're always looking at the research and what programs have been proven to work with certain populations? And are there things out there that we can provide to kids that are participating in motor vehicle thefts so that they don't in the future, right? There's a couple of programs throughout the country around restorative circles where, the kids actually talk with the victims of the crime and, to get their input and the feedback as to how it affected their lives. So that's one way. There's another program called Credible Messengers where kids and adults, young adults that have participated in this kind of activity in the past talk to young kids that are doing it. So our takeaway is we're going to continue to look at what's available to us because we're going to continue to get these kids, right? It's going to happen. And we want to make sure that we're prepared with the best services that we could provide through our juvenile probation officers to change that behavior and do our work around risk reduction.
Yeah. The next one I want to throw at you has to do with the diversion programs. And in the course of your answer, explain what those are because it may mean different things to different people. But here's the comment, and I'm going to try to inject as much attitude as I possibly can. And then I want to read you a sentence or two that appeared in an op-ed in the Record Journal, Meriden's in Wallingford and the area's newspaper. But diversion programs just let juvenile criminals escape accountability. They're coddled, they just let them escape accountability. And now the experts want to even expand diversionary programs. And listen to what Chris Powell wrote in part, appeared in the Record Journal today, Tuesday, April 30. He was talking about gun control, but this got into his column. It says, kids fooling around always will be hurting or killing themselves or others with something, much more so lately with stolen cars. But after stealing cars in Connecticut, they soon discover that the objective of the criminal justice system is only to keep them out of jail. True or false? Or in between.
Yeah.
I mean, I could definitely see where some, people have their own thoughts about diversion. The reality is that true diversion happens long before a case is referred to the juvenile court. There is front-end diversion that's available in the communities.
Diversion? Just walk us through.
Correct.
Yeah.
And so front-end diversion looks more like the juvenile review boards that I mentioned earlier that are located in most towns, not all. They are, made up of, community members, representatives from various state agencies, just people who really want to be a part of the solution. They're volunteering their time. Oftentimes, they're pulling together resources, funding resources to ensure that they're able to provide services to children and families. They may be able to connect them to behavioral health services that are available in the community. They may be able to connect kids to pro-social opportunities. We're talking about low-level, risk, clients. So clients who, maybe it's their first or second time getting involved in some type of behavior. It may very well be that incident that occurred, maybe in school or in the community and can benefit from someone, really connecting that child to a service and keeping them out of the court system. That's front-end diversion. As far as what happens when cases come into court, there is the notion of diverting kids away from residential placement, kids who just don't warrant that level of response. And I think when you start to talk about the more serious offenses, you really have to look at, our approach to working with kids is within risk reduction. We are using validated risk tools to really help us better understand who has the greatest likelihood of reoffending. And we want our resources to go to the ones who are, reoffending at a high rate or who have the likelihood of reoffending at a high rate.
So I'm going to keep up my attitude here. I think from what I'm hearing, Chris Powell is absolutely correct that the objective of the criminal justice system as it pertains to juveniles is to keep them out of jail. I guess the footnote would be, dear Chris, that's a good thing. But he meant it as a bad thing. Just a final thought on that, and I'm going to get to another quote about secrecy. But admitted,
Yeah.
Conceded,
yeah.
we want to keep him out of jail. Back at you, Chris Powell, right?
Yeah.
Isn't that what we're supposed to be?
Yeah, and I think your comment earlier was spot on in that you said, even when we send these kids in or adults in, right, they're going to get out at some point. right? So if we can work with them in the way
Yeah.
that Tasha was talking about, and we can change their behavior, we're all better off. The system is prepared, though. I mean, if whether it's a juvenile or an adult, and a person has to be incapacitated and incarcerated, then the system has that ability. So it's not that it never happens.
So let's talk about that for a minute. Again, what's the approximate size of the juvenile population that are somehow
Sure.
in a residential, either in jail or,
Yeah.
sort
So
of confined?
sure.
How
So
many?
we have two juvenile detention centers, one in Hartford and one in Bridgeport. And this morning we had 88 kids that were in those facilities between the two, 77 boys, 11 girls. And approximately 24 are in what's called a secure setting, so they have been adjudicated and they require that level of supervision. And then the balance would be their pretrials. So typically our census runs between, I would say, 65 and 70 to 90. That's typically the number of kids that we have in.
Doesn't sound like a lot, but your thoughts?
Well, just on the general, what you have here is Chris Powell is like a lot of conservative columnists. They want to lock everybody up. On the other hand, they're always claiming fiscal responsibility. And what I'd suggest people do is go to your computer and look up the cost to incarcerate someone for 1 year, and then consider the fact that there are people incarcerated who have packaged and sold relatively small amounts of drugs to people who are addicted. And look at what it costs you to keep those people in prison. Now, I'm not excusing any of it. They're breaking the law. But when you are packaging small amounts of drugs for sale, selling them to addicted people, and then it's costing me $50,000 a year or more to keep you in prison, probably a lot more than that. I mean, where's the fiscal sense in that?
And that's been, testified to, commented on, verified.
It's
an
mind-boggling.
expensive option, very expensive option.
Yeah.
I just want to read a couple of things that, again, come out of this TAO material that I have, the Youth Justice Institute out of the University of New Haven, for whatever it's worth. Early on, the JJPOC, that Oversight, Juvenile Justice Policy and Oversight Committee, I got that one, developed goals to improve youth justice in the state to be achieved by mid-2018, increased diversion of children and youth from juvenile court by 20%, decreased the number of children and youth confined or incarcerated in state-run facilities by 30%, and decreased the rate of recidivism among juvenile offenders by 10%. So there seems to be like two different cultures going on, at least as a layman from what I see. You have the culture going on in the neighborhood, be tougher. Be tougher. Grab them, keep them, lock
Sure.
them up for
Lock
a long
'em
period
up.
of time. And those experts in the field that sort of see the bigger picture say, no, that's actually the wrong direction. You got to increase diversion, decrease the population that are confined, and it's very striking. One reason why we have this segment of the show was sort of expose, this a little bit, expose in a good sense, But let me get to the other part of Chris Powell's column, which is a little off the track. He talks about a particular case, a particular kid that was arrested, something serious. I mean, he wasn't fooling around. The prosecutor said that the young man had been in and out of juvenile court for stealing cars for 2 years before the crash and still faces a murder charge and a shooting 2 days earlier. Another triumph of Connecticut's secret juvenile courts. I underlined it for the word secret. Why would Chris Powell use that word?
Yeah,
No, go
I
ahead,
think that, what Mr. Powell is referring to would be the protections that are afforded to children in the juvenile court system. Oftentimes, I think people are, take exception to some of those protections. One of the most, in my opinion, unique aspects of the juvenile court system is just around confidentiality and the fact that, Juvenile courts, are set up so that hearings are closed. Only the parties involved in those hearings are allowed to be present,
Why? What's the,
just to protect the juvenile, to ensure that their, information regarding their circumstances, that it's just not out to the public. One of the risk factors, when we started talking about, the negative impact of, bringing kids into a system really has to do with stigma, labeling, and the long-term effects of that on kids. There is certainly a degree of, privacy that's there for that child's own protection. There are a number of collateral consequences oftentimes that kids will face that go far beyond just that hearing in that courtroom, that quite honestly can follow them well into adulthood. There are erasure laws in place for juveniles. The way the system is designed, while there are some similarities to the adult system, kids certainly have the right to an attorney. They must have their parents, present when there's, some type of interviewing that's taking place. Parents can refuse to testify against their children unless they are the victim of a violent crime. There's just a number of protections in place to make sure that we are, really approaching juvenile court cases from a rehabilitative standpoint, as opposed to, criminalizing them even further.
so,
Just
go ahead, yeah.
one thing real quick, that's not a judicial branch policy, right? And how we manage the courts, that's mandated by Connecticut general statute,
Yeah.
the confidentiality and the, yeah.
Okay. So I guess the point is, and the hope is, one day these kids will move on and open up another phase of their life, and they don't want as an anchor around their neck some 5-year-old article, that pops up. They want to be able to, or give them every opportunity to turn their lives around. And if you have this publicity out there, that interferes with that goal, I think.
That's an excellent point. And
guess.
the best of my memory
Yeah.
is that these legislative, the fact that there were laws that increased the privacy of juvenile proceedings did not come from Meriden or other other cities or even inner city communities. My memory is that these legislative initiatives came from more affluent towns where people were concerned that
Okay. They're
if you
little
were
Johnny.
right, and that this would follow him. So again,
Okay.
I'm not saying there may have been individual efforts, and certainly inner city communities have become more vocal about this of late. I'm just going back over decades
Right.
and remembering that's generally where those initiatives came from. But yet people tend to angrily point towards the cities and say, why are we covering up what's going on in New Haven? And it's just not
Well,
fair.
I think the implication of those who say that is you're only keeping it secret because you're ashamed of your program. It's not working, and you don't want to admit it. I think that's where Chris Powell was
Right,
coming
but-
from.
and
a
that's-
secret
Okay,
system.
and not to because this one, but
guess.
anybody like me who had to cover inner city areas, areas we associate with crime.
Yeah.
Whether or not their juvenile crimes are secret was not that was not a topic that was foremost in their mind. Were their juvenile crimes or any of their crimes going to be kept? That's not where this came from.
Yeah. Okay.
And I think it's also important to point out just the connection that's federal law, also that drives that whole piece. And, when we look at all of the players, and there are a number of players involved in a juvenile court case, the one player who tends to be on the outskirts of it all oftentimes is the victim. And fortunately, there's state statute that does allow for information sharing with the victim. There are a number of, key stakeholders who are identified in statute who have access to juvenile information either for the purpose of serving that juvenile or for the purpose of conducting legitimate investigations and, just court work. So there is information that's out there. It's just a matter of who has access to it.
So we got maybe about 4 minutes left, and I'm going to try to squeeze in 2 questions, so we got to be pithy with this. We have heard that juvenile detention, I'm not talking about the adult system, but the juvenile detention is so loose and lax, kids game the system, they kind of mock it, take advantage of it, they don't take it seriously. True or false? Or in between?
No, I mean, juvenile detention is a secure facility, and we run a very good facility. They are accredited through the American Correctional Association and the National Commission on Health Care. So we're duly accredited. I think we're the only state in the country that has duly accredited detention system. So I'm not quite sure where that characterization of our detention centers comes from, Mike. But we do a very good job, and our juvenile detention staff do an outstanding job of providing safe, secure facilities for the kids.
And finally, this is going to be the last word. When a juvenile is transferred to the adult docket, does that mean that he can be sentenced like an adult, do 10 years time, 20 years, 15, big, long sentences, and housed in with hardened adults? Is that what that means when you transfer to the adult docket?
Yeah, so when they're in the adult court system, when they're transferred to the adult docket, the same penalties for that particular statute violation
They're
apply.
in the yard with the general adult population, so to speak.
Well, yeah, and the Department of Correction can speak more to this issue, but I believe that, they have the Manson Youth Institute where they try to separate the younger kids or the younger emerging adults that they have in the adult system from the other adults.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Let's make that the final
Sure.
specific word on it. Gary, I want to give you, if you want, maybe 15 or 20 seconds for sort of like the final philosophical thought.
Yeah.
What your hopes are going forward.
Sure. So I just want to say that again, we're fortunate here in Connecticut. The legislature does provide us with services for the kids that we supervise, and I think we have an outstanding juvenile probation system and juvenile probation officers, and the same with our juvenile detention centers. But we can always do better, and that's what we're here to do, is to see where we can make improvements, because at the end of the day, we're about risk reduction and making our community safer, and we can always do better, right? So that's our charge, and we're going to continue to work at it.
Let's make that the final word. Thanks, Tasha Hunt and Gary Roberge, for coming on the
Thank you.
Susan Mike Show.
Thanks.
Our viewers in Wallingford and everyone who watches YouTube, I think should be impressed with the information that you've given us. So
Thank you.
We deeply thank you, and WPAA thanks you also. And thank you, the viewers of the Susan Mike Show, for tuning in. We're here at WPAA. It'll go up on the channel, WPAA.tv, Thursdays, Fridays, Monday, Tuesday, and Wednesdays. In a couple of days, it's up on YouTube. If you're familiar with YouTube, and I know you all are if you watch this show, go to the Citizen Mike Wallingford channel, follow all the usual prompts, and be able to get it. Or get in touch with me through the studio. We can email you a direct link to the Citizen Mike Show. Again, thanks to Gary Roberge and Tasha Hunt. Good night, everybody.